From the shadows of the Copacabana, they were the biggest act in the history of show business. They slept in the same bed, shared the same money, and loved each other like brothers. But by 1956, that love had turned into a hatred so deep it was suffocating. On their 10th anniversary, exactly 10 years from the day they started, Dean Martin looked at Jerry Lewis backstage at the Copacabana and realized, if I don't leave him tonight, I'm going to kill him. But there was someone else in that dressing room that night, someone who saw everything, someone who never told their story. Until now, the witness nobody remembers. Eddie Russo was the backstage manager at the Copacabana in 1956. He'd worked there for 15 years, seen every major act in America. Eddie kept a journal, not for publication, just personal notes about the performers who passed through those doors. His entry from July 25, 1956 begins, "Tonight, I watched two men commit emotional murder on stage. And the worst part? They were killing themselves." Eddie saw something the audience didn't. Before Dean walked out that final night, he stood alone in the hallway for exactly 7 minutes. Eddie watched him stare at a photograph, a black and white snapshot from 1946, Atlantic City. Two young kids with matching suits and wild dreams, arms around each other, laughing at something only they found funny. Dean tucked the photo back in his wallet. He didn't throw it away. That detail matters. Understanding the magnitude. To understand the sheer magnitude of the breakup of Martin and Lewis, you have to understand who they were. You can't compare them to anyone today. They weren't just famous, they were a mania. They were the Beatles before the Beatles. They were Elvis before Elvis. From 1946 to 1956, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis owned America. They owned the nightclubs, they owned television, they owned the movies, and they owned the radio. They were a two-headed monster of comedy and music that generated millions of dollars a year in an era when a movie ticket cost a quarter. But here's what the history books leave out. Their combined income in 1955 was $12 million. That's equivalent to $137 million in today's money. They were making more than most corporations. The pressure to maintain that empire crushed them slowly, like a vice tightening 1/4 turn per year. The formula was magic. The handsome, relaxed, velvet-voiced Italian Dean and the manic, screeching, chaotic man-child Jerry. Dean represented cool. Jerry represented chaos. Dean was the anchor. Jerry was the storm on stage. They had a chemistry that couldn't be taught. They cut each other's ties. They threw water on each other. They ad-libbed. They kissed. They hugged. The audience believed they were watching two men having the time of their lives. And for a long time, they were. The brotherhood. They were inseparable. They were Dino and Jay. They bought matching suits. They finished each other's sentences. They were brothers in every sense of the word except blood. The psychological truth? Dr. Margaret Sullivan analyzed their partnership in 1998 for a documentary. She described it as codependent fusion. They literally didn't know where one ended and the other began. Jerry once said in a 1952 interview, "Sometimes I wake up and forget which one of us is me." That level of enmeshment is psychologically dangerous. When boundaries dissolve completely, any assertion of independence feels like betrayal. But fame is a poison, and when you drink it from a fire hose for 10 years straight, it starts to change you. The brotherly love began to curdle into jealousy. The playfulness turned into cruelty, and the partnership that was supposed to last forever began to rot from the inside out. By 1956, the two men who made the whole world laugh were living in a private hell of silence, resentment, and rage. This is the autopsy of a friendship. The word that changed everything. The trouble started with a word, and that word was genius. In the early days, they were equal partners. They split the money 50-50. They split the billing 50-50. But as their fame grew, the critics began to rewrite the narrative. They looked at Jerry Lewis with his rubber face, his physical comedy, his pratfalls, and they called him a comedic genius. They called him the next Charlie Chaplin. And Dean? The critics called him the straight man. They called him the stooge. They said he was just a handsome guy who stood there and sang while Jerry did the real work. This narrative was false. Any comedian will tell you that the straight man is the hardest job in the business. Dean Martin's timing was impeccable. His reaction shots were what made Jerry funny. Without Dean's cool stability, Jerry was just noise. Dean grounded him. Dean made him human. The hidden context. What most people don't know is that Paramount Pictures had a secret plan in 1954. Internal memos, unsealed in 2003, revealed studio executives discussing the Jerry Lewis solo strategy. They wanted to groom Jerry as their next Bob Hope. Dean was expendable in their eyes. Jerry saw these memos. He never told Dean. That betrayal, choosing career security over partnership honesty, was the first crack in the foundation. The shift in power. By 1954, Jerry wasn't just performing. He was trying to control everything. He wanted to write the scripts. He wanted to direct the scenes. He wanted to edit the movies. He began to treat Dean not as a partner, but as an employee, a prop, a piece of furniture that sang, "That's amore." The dynamic shifted. Jerry became the auteur, and Dean became the actor. Dean Martin was a proud man. He was a man who had survived the rough streets of Steubenville. He didn't care about getting credit for directing or writing, but he demanded respect, and he felt it slipping away. He started to see it in the little things. Jerry would cut Dean's lines in the movies. Jerry would turn the volume down on Dean's microphone during live shows so his voice would be louder. Jerry would crop Dean out of publicity photos. There's a famous story about a Look magazine photo shoot in April 1955. The photographers took hundreds of pictures of the two of them. When the magazine came out, Dean had been cropped out of almost every photo. It was just page after page of Jerry. Dean looked at the magazine, tossed it in the trash, and poured himself a drink. He didn't yell. He just filed it away in the cabinet of resentments building in his heart. Dean's daughter, Deanna Martin, later revealed, "Dad kept that magazine. I found it in his study after he died. He'd circled every photo he'd been cut from in red pen. 15 circles. He counted every single one." The Cold War. By 1955, the Brotherhood was dead. They were in a Cold War. They were filming movies together. You're Never Too Young, artists and models, but they weren't speaking. Imagine the tension. The director would yell, "Action!" and Dean and Jerry would turn on the charm, laughing and joking for the camera. The director would yell, "Cut!" and they would instantly turn their backs on each other and walk to separate corners of the set. They communicated through intermediaries. "Tell Mr. Lewis I'm going to lunch. Tell Mr. Martin he's needed in makeup." It was suffocating. The crew walked on eggshells. Everyone knew the bomb was ticking. They just didn't know when it would explode. A crew member's perspective. Sound engineer Tommy Morrison wrote in his memoir, published in 1989, "I watched Jerry cry in his trailer between takes. Not dramatic crying, just silent tears rolling down his face while he stared at nothing. He knew he was losing Dean and he didn't know how to stop it, but his pride wouldn't let him apologize." The breaking point. The breaking point came during the filming of their final movie, ironically titled Hollywood or Bust. Jerry was out of control. He was directing the director. He was screaming at the crew. He was demanding retakes of scenes that were perfectly fine. Dean Martin, who prided himself on being professional, show up, know your lines, hit your mark, go home, was exhausted by the drama. One afternoon on set, Jerry started berating Dean in front of the cast.
He criticized his acting. He criticized his lack of passion. Dean looked at him. He didn't scream. He just said, "You know what your problem is, Jerry? You're nothing but a dollar sign to me now." It was a brutal insult. It stripped away the art, the friendship, the history. It reduced Jerry to a paycheck. Jerry was devastated, but he was also vicious. He fired back, "And you're nothing without me. You're just a crooner who got lucky. Without me, you'd be back dealing blackjack in Ohio." The line was drawn. There was no going back.
The final performance. They finished the movie, but the contract still obligated them to perform a final run of shows at the Copacabana in New York City. The site of their greatest triumphs would become the site of their execution. Copacabana, New York City, July 25, 1956. It was the hottest ticket in the world. The audience was packed with celebrities, mobsters, and socialites. But the air in the room wasn't festive. It was heavy. Everyone knew this was the end. The newspapers had already leaked the rumors of the breakup. The audience felt like they were attending a funeral for a marriage. Backstage, the atmosphere was funereal. Dean and Jerry shared a dressing room. For 10 years, that room had been filled with laughter, practical jokes, and camaraderie. Tonight, it was silent. Dean sat at his vanity, adjusting his tuxedo. Jerry sat at his, looking pale and manic. They didn't look at each other in the mirror. 10 years, exactly 10 years from the day since they had first teamed up at the 500 Club in Atlantic City. "Happy anniversary," Jerry muttered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah," Dean replied, not looking up. "Let's get this over with." What Eddie Russo saw? Jerry's hands were shaking so badly he couldn't button his collar. Dean buttoned it for him, didn't say a word, just walked over and did it. That's when I knew they still loved each other, and that's what made it so heartbreaking. The show. They walked toward the curtain. Usually they would hug before going on. Usually they would pump each other up. Tonight they stood 5 feet apart, staring at the floor. The announcer's voice boomed. "Ladies and gentlemen, for the last time, Martin and Lewis." The curtain rose. The audience erupted. It was a wall of sound. And then the show began. It wasn't their usual show. It was a train wreck. It was brilliant, but it was uncomfortable. The anger that had been bottling up for 2 years spilled out onto the stage. They stopped doing written skits. They started ad-libbing insults, real insults. "You're slurring your words, Dino," Jerry squawked. "Better than slurring my brain, pal," Dean shot back. The audience laughed, but it was nervous laughter. They were watching 2 men tearing each other apart in real time. At one point, Jerry grabbed Dean's tie and yanked it. Dean shoved him away, harder than usual. There was a flash of genuine violence in Dean's eyes. He looked ready to throw a punch, but he didn't. He channeled it. He sang. He sang "Memories Are Made of This" with a defiance that chilled the room. He was singing to prove a point. "I can do this without you." From the audience, socialite Gloria Vanderbilt wrote in her diary that night, "I've never felt such tension in a theater. It was like watching a marriage dissolve in front of 500 witnesses. I wanted to look away, but couldn't." The end. The show dragged on. It was messy. It was chaotic. It was sad. Finally, they reached the end, the closing song, Partners. They stood side by side. They were supposed to link arms. They didn't. They just stood there, sweating under the hot lights, singing lyrics that felt like a lie. "You and me will be partners." The song ended. The band played the outro. The audience stood up, cheering, screaming, begging for an encore. They didn't want it to end. They wanted the dream to continue. Jerry looked at Dean. There were tears in Jerry's eyes. He looked like a scared little boy who realized he had pushed his big brother too far. He looked like he wanted to apologize. He looked like he wanted to fix it. Dean looked at Jerry, and his face was a mask of stone. He didn't bow, he didn't wave, he didn't say goodbye to the crowd. Dean Martin simply turned his back on the audience, turned his back on Jerry Lewis, and walked off the stage. The aftermath. He walked straight to the dressing room. He didn't stop to talk to the well-wishers. He loosened his tie, he poured a drink. Jerry came running in a minute later, panting, sweating. Dino, we can't end like this. The crowd, they love us. We can fix this. Let's take a break, take a vacation. We can come back in the fall." Dean looked at him in the mirror. He saw the desperation. "It's over, Jerry," Dean said quietly. "It can't be over. We're Martin and Lewis. We're the kings of the world. You can't walk away from this money. You can't walk away from me." Dean finished his drink. He picked up his jacket. He put on his hat. "You know what, Jay?" Dean said with a strange sense of peace. "I'd rather play a dive bar as Dean Martin than play the palace as Jerry Lewis's stooge." He walked out into the New York night. What Eddie Russo remembers? After Dean left, Jerry collapsed, not dramatically, just sank to the floor and sat there for 2 hours. I brought him water. He didn't drink it. He just kept saying, "What did I do? What did I do?" over and over.
The bet everyone lost. Dean didn't have a plan. He didn't have a movie deal. His agent had told him he was making a mistake. The press was already writing his obituary. Dean Martin, the straight man, goes solo. Everyone bet on him to fail. Everyone bet on Jerry to soar. Dean walked down the street alone. The silence of the city felt good after 10 years of screaming noise. He lit a cigarette. He looked up at the stars. He was terrified. But for the first time in a decade, he was free. The twist nobody saw coming? Jerry's solo career did succeed, but it never matched the heights of Martin and Lewis. He made great films, The Nutty Professor and The Bellboy, but box office numbers show he peaked during the partnership. His highest-grossing solo film made $4.2 million. Their worst film together made $6 million. Meanwhile, Dean exploded into stratospheric success that shocked Hollywood. The silence. That night at the Copa was the start of the longest silence in show business history. For 20 years, Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis did not speak. They lived in the same city, Los Angeles. They ate at the same restaurants. They had the same friends. Frank Sinatra was friends with both, but they never spoke. If Dean walked into a restaurant and saw Jerry, he would turn around and leave. If Jerry saw Dean on TV, he would turn it off. The pain was too deep. It was like a divorce where the love had been too strong to ever settle into friendship. Frank Sinatra's perspective. In his autobiography, Frank wrote, "I tried for years to get them in the same room. Dean would say, 'Not yet, Pally, not yet.' Jerry would just shake his head. I realized they weren't avoiding each other out of hate. They were avoiding each other because they still loved each other too much." Dean's triumph. And contrary to everyone's predictions, Dean didn't fail. In fact, he soared. He released Everybody Loves Somebody in 1964 and knocked the Beatles off the top of the charts. He starred in Rio Bravo with John Wayne and proved he could act. He launched The Dean Martin Show, which became the highest-rated TV show in America. He proved Jerry wrong. He proved the critics wrong. He proved he was never a stooge. He was a king. The modern parallel? Think about Simon and Garfunkel. Think about the White Stripes. Think about any partnership that became toxic, where one person's identity got swallowed by the collective. The breakup isn't the tragedy. Staying together would have been the tragedy. But deep down, in the quiet moments, Dean missed him. He missed the chaotic genius of the kid he used to share a sandwich with in Atlantic City. And Jerry missed the cool, steady hand of the big brother who kept him safe. The reunion. It wasn't until 1976 on live television during the MDA telethon that Frank Sinatra orchestrated the reunion. When Frank brought Dean out on stage, the world stopped. Jerry looked shocked. Dean looked nervous. They hugged. And in that hug, 20 years of anger evaporated, leaving only the sadness of lost time. Dean leaned in and whispered something in Jerry's ear. For years, people wondered what he said. Was it a joke? Was it an apology? Jerry later revealed that Dean simply whispered, "I love you, you crazy son of a bitch." What happened after the camera stopped? They went to a diner, just the two of them. They talked for 4 hours. They didn't become partners again. They didn't become best friends, but they made peace with the choices they'd made. Jerry said later, "We were two kids who wanted the same thing, to be loved, to be seen, to matter. We just went about it in ways that destroyed each other." The lesson we still need. The breakup of Martin and Lewis wasn't just a showbiz story. It was a tragedy of human nature. It showed us that sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes egos get in the way. Sometimes you have to leave the person you love most in order to find yourself. The psychological truth: when partnerships become toxic, staying loyal to the relationship means becoming disloyal to yourself. Dean chose himself. That wasn't selfish, that was survival. Dean Martin walked out of the Copacabana in 1956 as half of a comedy team. He woke up the next morning as a legend in his own right. He paid the price of loneliness for his freedom. But looking back at the legacy he built, the songs, the movies, the cool, you have to admit he won the bet. Eddie Russo's final journal entry about them, 1995, "I saw hundreds of acts come through the Copa. None burned as bright as Martin and Lewis, and none burned out as completely. But here's what I learned watching them. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go. Dean loved Jerry enough to leave, and eventually Jerry understood that." This is Dean Martin, the untold legacy. Have you ever had to walk away from a friend to save yourself? Tell us your story in the comments. And if you want to know what really happened in that diner in 1976, make sure you're subscribed. Until then, keep the laughter alive and know when it's time to walk away.